Rule 6 didn't tell me what to do. That was the first thing that made it different. The other rules in the black notebook were instructions. Don't open this door. Don't answer that phone. Don't correct a file after a certain hour. Don't look too long at any document with your own name on it. Rule 6 was not an instruction. It was a statement. It said I was already inside. I don't work at the Braeburn County Public Records Annex anymore. Nobody does. At least, nobody the county admits to employing. The building is still there. I checked last week on Google Maps. Satellite view sitting at the end of Campion Road like it always did. Half hidden behind the tree line. Parking lot empty. Windows dark. The county website still lists it as active. There's still a phone number. I called it once, about 3 months after I left. It rang 11 times. Then someone picked up and said nothing. They just held the line open, breathing so quietly I couldn't tell if it was a person or the building settling around them. I counted 40 seconds before I heard it, a filing cabinet drawer sliding shut, slow and careful, the way you'd close one if you didn't want the person listening to know you were there. Then the call, disconnected. Now, I haven't called back. I need to talk about what happened during the 9 nights I worked there, because I don't think the annex is finished with me. More than that, I don't think the job is finished with me. The position, the night shift, the little set of duties they handed me, like any of it was normal. I think all of it is still running somewhere. I stopped showing up, but I don't think I ever really left. And there is one thing it still wants me to do. I know that now. I also know that writing it down may be enough to start it. So before I explain the notebook, or Rule 6, or why the annex was never as empty as it looked, I need to tell you how I got hired in the first place. My name is Corinne Blackwell, and in October of last year, I was 34 years old, newly certified as a records management technician through an online program that cost me $2,000 I didn't really have, and 7 months into the most humiliating stretch of unemployment I'd ever experienced. I'd left a decent admin job at a veterinary hospital in Dayton because my mother had a stroke and needed full-time help. And I'd moved back to Braeburn County, which is in southern Ohio, if you've never heard of it, and you probably haven't, to take care of her. She died 11 weeks after I arrived. The house was paid off, but the medical debt wasn't. And suddenly, I was living alone in my dead mother's house in a county with a population of 9,000. No professional contacts, and a certification that qualified me for exactly the kind of job that doesn't exist in rural Appalachian Ohio. So when I saw the listing on the County Employment Board Records Annex Night Technician, part-time, $17.50 per hour, immediate start, I applied within the hour. The listing was short. It asked for records management experience or certification, comfort working alone, and availability for overnight shifts, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., Sunday through Thursday. It mentioned that the position involved maintaining and monitoring the physical document archive at the county's secondary record storage facility. There was no interview. I received an email 2 days later from an address I didn't recognize. Not a county.gov address, but a generic Gmail telling me I'd been selected and to report to the facility the following Sunday at 9:45 p.m. The email included a 4-digit door code and a single instruction. Please do not arrive early. I almost didn't go. Not because of anything suspicious at that point. It just seemed like a disorganized county office with a sloppy hiring process, but because the drive out to the annex took 40 minutes on roads I didn't know, and it was raining, and the GPS kept trying to reroute me onto a state highway that added 20 minutes. I found Campion Road by accident, or really, missed my turn, pulled into what I thought was a driveway to turn around, and realized it was the road. The annex was at the very end, past a 1/4 mile of cracked asphalt lined with pin oaks, so dense their canopy made a tunnel, even with half the leaves already gone. The building itself was a single-story brick rectangle, maybe 50 feet wide and twice as deep, with a flat roof and no signage except a small brass plate beside the front door that read, Braeburn County Public Records Annex 2. There were no other cars in the lot. There was one sodium light on a pole at the far edge of the gravel, casting an orange wash over the building's face that made the brick look like it was sweating. I parked near the entrance and sat in my car for a few minutes. The rain had stopped, but the trees were still dripping, and in my headlights I could see water running in thin streams across the parking lot toward a drain I couldn't locate. I checked my phone, 9:38 p.m. The email said 9:45, and it had specifically said not to arrive early. I wasn't sure if that meant don't arrive at the building early or don't enter early, so I waited. At 9:44, I got out and walked to the door. The brass plate was old, not antique, just neglected. The kind of brass that no one had polished in 15 years. The door itself was heavy steel with a numeric keypad mounted at waist height. I entered the 4-digit code from the email. The lock clicked. I pushed the door open. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not unpleasant, exactly, but specific. Old paper, yes, but also something chemical underneath it, like the preservative they use in anatomy labs, but fainter, more diluted, as if it had been in the air so long it had become part of the building's breath. The lights were already on, fluorescent tubes, the long kind, mounted in ceiling panels. About a third of them were working. The rest were either dead or flickering at a frequency just slow enough to notice. I was standing in a narrow front room, maybe 10 by 15 feet, with a gray laminate counter running along the left wall, a metal desk in the corner, and a single interior door directly ahead. The counter was bare except for a desk lamp that was already on, a corded telephone that looked like it was from the early 90s, and a small digital clock with red numbers showing 9:46. There was a wheeled office chair behind the desk. On the desk was a manila folder with a yellow sticky note on the front. The sticky note said, in printed handwriting, "Night text, start here." I opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a printed welcome page, if you could call it that. It was formatted like an internal memo, addressed to incoming night technician from Records Management, Annex 2. It welcomed me to the position, stated that my role was to monitor the physical archive, ensure environmental stability, and process any incoming document transfers that arrived during my shift. It mentioned that the archive was housed in the main storage room through the interior door, that the environmental monitoring system was analog and required manual readings every 2 hours, and that all shift activity was to be logged in the notebook provided. At the bottom of the page, in smaller type, it said, "Please review the supplementary instructions before entering the archive. The supplementary instructions are inside the notebook." I looked around the desk. There was no notebook on it. I checked the drawers. The desk had 3 on the right side, all unlocked. The top drawer held pens, a small flashlight, and a ring of 4 brass keys on a paper tag that said Archive Access. The middle drawer was empty. The bottom drawer held a single object. It was a black notebook, hardcover, about the size of a trade paperback, with a matte black surface that felt almost soft, like fabric over cardboard. On the front cover, embossed in silver and slightly off-center, was a small triangle. Not equilateral, it was taller than it was wide, almost like an arrowhead pointing up. There was no title, no label, no other marking. I opened it. The first page was blank. The second page was blank. I flipped forward. Pages 3 through 6 were blank. Then, starting on page 7, there was handwriting. Not printed cursive, small and careful, in black ink that looked fresh despite the yellowed edges of the pages. At the top of page 7, underlined once, it said, "Supplementary Instructions, Annex 2 Night Technician." Below that, these instructions are specific to the overnight monitoring position. They are not included in the county's standard onboarding materials. Do not contact the county office to verify or clarify them. Do not photograph these pages. Follow each instruction without exception. Begin reading only after the front door has fully closed behind you. I looked back at the front door. It was closed. I didn't remember closing it, but the building was silent and the door was flush in its frame. No gap at the bottom, no draft. I turned back to the notebook. The instructions were numbered. There were 12. I'll write them as close to how they appeared as I can remember. Because the specific wording mattered, I would learn that later. 1. At the beginning of each shift, Record the time you entered the building in the log section at the back of this notebook. Use the clock on the front desk only. Do not use your phone, your watch, or any other timekeeping device. If the clock on the desk is not running, do not start your shift. Leave and return the following night. 2. The interior door to the archive will be unlocked when you arrive. Enter the archive within 15 minutes of starting your shift. If you have not entered by 10:15 p.m., do not enter at all. Remain in the front room for the duration of your shift and log "no entry delayed" in the notebook. 3. The archive is arranged in 12 rows. Rows are labeled A through L. Do not enter row H after midnight. If you have already entered row H before midnight, leave it before 12 a.m., regardless of what you are doing. 4. Environmental readings must be taken at 12 a.m., 2 a.m., and 4 a.m. using the analog thermometer and hygrometer mounted on the wall between rows D and E. Record the readings in the log section. If the temperature reading is below 48 degrees Fahrenheit, close the archive door and do not reopen it until your next scheduled reading. 5. If the telephone in the front room rings between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., answer it. Listen to whatever is said. Do not respond. Hang up after the caller finishes. Log the time and duration of the call. If the telephone rings at any other time, do not answer it. 6. You are already inside the active index. Your entry was cataloged when you opened this notebook. This is not a warning. This is a status update. Proceed with your shift. I stopped reading. I read instruction 6 again. Then I read it a third time. The handwriting didn't change. The words didn't rearrange themselves into something less unsettling. You are already inside the active index. I looked at the notebook's cover, the silver triangle, the matte black surface that now felt somehow heavier in my hands. Your entry was cataloged when you opened this notebook. I wanted to put it down. I didn't, because instruction 6 also said, proceed with your shift. And I needed this job, and I was already here. And the rational part of my brain, the part that had gotten me through my mother's death, and the debt, and the long blank months of nothing, was already constructing a reasonable explanation. Someone with a dark sense of humor had written these. County employees, bored overnight workers, the same people who put fake warning signs in office kitchens. It was a hazing thing, an initiation. I kept reading. 7. Between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. you may hear filing cabinet drawers opening or closing in the archive. Do not investigate the sound. Continue your work in whatever row you are currently in. If you are not in a row when the sound occurs, remain in the front room until it stops. 8. If you find a document with your name on it anywhere in the archive, do not read it. Place it face down on the front desk and log the row and shelf where you found it. Do not return to that row for the rest of your shift. I finished the remaining instructions 9 through 12, but I'll get to those later, because they didn't become relevant until my third night. What mattered in that moment was instruction 6. It was different from the others. The others were procedural: do this, don't do that, follow this timing. Instruction 6 was a statement, a declaration. It wasn't telling me how to behave. It was telling me what I already was. I looked at the digital clock, 10:02 p.m. I had 13 minutes to enter the archive, per instruction 2. I picked up one of the pens from the top drawer, turned to the back of the notebook where there were lined pages under the heading Shift Log, and wrote the date and time, 10:02 p.m. Then I took the brass keys from the drawer, stood up, and walked to the interior door. It was unlocked, just as the instructions said it would be. I pushed it open and stepped inside the archive. The room was enormous, far larger than the building's exterior suggested, though I didn't think about that until later. It extended back into darkness beyond the reach of the fluorescent lights, which only covered the first 8 or 9 rows. The rows themselves were industrial shelving units, steel-framed, bolted to the floor, each one about 7 feet tall and perhaps 30 feet long. They were densely packed with bankers' boxes, file folders, rolled documents, and the occasional cardboard tube. Everything was labeled, but the labeling system made no sense to me. Not standard county filing codes, not alphabetical, not chronological. The labels on the boxes I could see from the door were strings of numbers and single letters that followed no pattern I could recognize. The air was cooler in here, not cold, but noticeably different from the front room dryer, stiller, as if the ventilation system either didn't reach this far or had been deliberately turned off. The smell was stronger here too, that chemical underneath, that faint preservative tang, and beneath it something else I couldn't name, something organic, like the smell of a room where someone has been sleeping for a very long time. I found the thermometer and hygrometer between rows D and E, exactly where the notebook said they'd be. Analog instruments, old but functional, mounted on a small wooden board screwed into the end cap of row D's shelving. The temperature read 53 degrees. The humidity read 41%. I made a mental note to log these at midnight. Then I walked the rows, a through G first, slowly, just getting a sense of the space. The shelving was dense but orderly. Someone had maintained this place. The boxes were aligned. The folders were upright. The dust was minimal in the first several rows. But as I moved deeper, past row E, past row F, the order started to slip. Boxes were turned sideways. Folders were stacked on top of each other rather than filed vertically. In row G, I found a shelf where several boxes had been pulled forward, their lids removed, their contents partially spilled onto the shelf below. I didn't touch them. I stopped at row H. The lights didn't reach row H fully. Only the first few feet were lit, and beyond that the row receded into a murky gray that swallowed the details of what was on the shelves. I checked my phone. It was 10:31 p.m., well before midnight. According to instruction 3, I was allowed to be here, but I didn't go in. I stood at the entrance to row H and looked down the length of it, and something in the quality of the air, not the temperature, not the smell, but something physical I couldn't articulate, told me the row was different. The boxes in the first few feet of visible shelving weren't standard banker's boxes. They were thinner, darker, and they didn't have labels on their spines. They had labels on their fronts, small white rectangles, handwritten, each one bearing what looked like a name and a date. I leaned in just enough to read the nearest one. Patricia Kern, September 14th, 2019. I looked at the next one. David Almeida, March 7th, 2021, and the next. Marcus Cole, November 22nd, 2022. The most recent one I could see, at the edge where the light gave out. Janine Tor, June 15th, 2023. I stepped back from row H. I returned to the front room, sat down at the desk, and stared at the black notebook for a long time. Then I opened it to instruction 6 and read it once more. You are already inside the active index. Your entry was cataloged when you opened this notebook, somewhere deep in the archive, past the reach of the lights. I heard a filing cabinet drawer slide open. Then, after a pause that lasted exactly as long as a slow breath, it slid closed again. I didn't leave that first night. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. I heard that drawer. I read those names. I felt the wrongness of row H, and I stayed. Not because I was brave, because the sound stopped, and the silence that followed was so complete and so ordinary that I was able to convince myself I'd misheard it. Old buildings settle, metal contracts in cold air, filing cabinets in an unheated archive. Of course they'd make sounds. I sat at the front desk, and I told myself a story about thermal expansion, and the story worked well enough to get me through to midnight. At midnight, I took my first official environmental reading. 51 degrees, 39% humidity. Both within range. The notebook didn't specify what the acceptable ranges were, but instruction 4 only flagged temperatures below 48, so I logged the numbers and felt a small professional satisfaction at performing the task correctly. That's how it works, I think. The job gives you a task, the task gives you a role, the role gives you a reason to stay. You stop being a person in a frightening situation and start being a technician performing a function. The function feels safe. The function feels like it has edges you can hold. I did not enter row H. At 1:47 a.m., the telephone rang. I was in the front room, sitting at the desk, reading the welcome memo again to see if I'd missed anything. The phone was 18 inches from my right hand. It was an old desk phone, beige plastic, the kind with a coiled cord and a handset that weighed half a pound. It rang with a real bell, not an electronic tone, a sharp, mechanical sound that felt too loud for the small room. I flinched. Then I remembered instruction 5. Between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., answer it. Listen. Do not respond. Hang up after the caller finishes. I picked up the handset. For the first 3 or 4 seconds, there was nothing. Not silence. Nothing. The absence of signal. The dead frequency of a line that's connected but carrying no information. Then, gradually, I became aware of a sound underneath the nothing. Not a voice. Not static. A texture like paper being turned, slowly, one page at a time. Someone leafing through a document. The turning was rhythmic, unhurried, and it continued for what the desk clock told me was 2 minutes and 14 seconds. Then it stopped, and a voice said one word. Confirmed! The line went dead. I hung up. I logged the time, 1:47 a.m., and the duration, approximately 2 minutes 20 seconds, and the content, which I recorded as paper sounds, then single word, confirmed. My hand was steady when I wrote it. I don't know what that says about me. The rest of that first night was quiet. I took my 2 a.m. reading, 50 degrees, 38%, and my 4 a.m. reading, 49 degrees, 37%. The temperature was dropping slowly, but stayed above 48. I did not re-enter the archive after midnight. I sat at the desk, I watched the clock, and at 6 a.m. I wrote my shift end time in the log, placed the notebook back in the bottom drawer, and left. The drive home was unremarkable. The sun was coming up through the pin oaks, and the road looked entirely different in the light, just a cracked county road through unremarkable woods. I went home. I slept. I came back Sunday night. The second shift was almost identical to the first. Same entry time, same procedure. I opened the notebook to log my start, and everything was as I'd left it. My entries from the first night, my handwriting, my readings. The instructions on pages 7 through 9 hadn't changed. The archive was the same. The smell was the same. I took my readings. I avoided row H after midnight, and at 2:11 a.m., the phone rang again. This time, the paper-turning sound lasted only 40 seconds, and the voice, the same voice, flat, neither male nor female, like someone reading a single word from a card, said, updated. Then the line died. I logged it. I finished the shift. I went home. The third night is when things changed. I arrived at 9:45 p.m., entered the code, stepped into the front room, and immediately noticed 2 things. First, the desk lamp was off. It had been on when I arrived for my first 2 shifts already lit, as if someone had turned it on before I got there, even though I was supposedly the only person working here. Tonight it was dark, and I had to feel along the wall for the overhead switch, which I found after a few seconds. The fluorescence in the front room buzzed to life. Second, the notebook was not in the bottom drawer. It was on the desk, centered on the laminate surface, closed, the silver triangle facing up. I had put it in the drawer at the end of my last shift. I was certain of that. It was part of the closing routine I'd already built for myself. Log end time, close notebook, bottom drawer, pushchair in. Someone had taken it out, or it had been taken out. Or, and this was the thought I didn't want to have, it had moved itself to where it wanted to be. I opened it. My previous log entries were there. My handwriting, my readings, my phone call notes. But there was something new. Between the instruction pages and the log pages, in a section I hadn't noticed before, or that hadn't existed before, there were 2 additional pages of handwriting, different handwriting, not the careful cursive of the original instructions. This was smaller, more cramped, written in blue ink instead of black, and it slanted hard to the left, like the person who'd written it was left-handed or in a hurry. At the top of the first new page, it said, "Notes from previous technician do not discard." And below, if you're reading this, you're past your second shift, which means they haven't pulled your file yet. Good, that buys you time. I don't know how much. I'm writing this because nobody wrote it for me and I needed someone to. The instructions in the front of this notebook are real. Follow them. But there are things the instructions don't tell you, and those things matter more than the rules. First, the names in row H are not old records. They are current. Every name in row H belongs to someone who held this position before you. I counted 31 boxes when I started. When I left, there were 33. The 2 new ones appeared during my shifts. I did not create them. I did not file them. They were simply there one night when they hadn't been the night before, and each one had a name and a date on the front. The dates were the dates those people stopped coming to work. I stopped reading. I looked at the interior door to the archive. It was closed. I looked back at the notebook. Second, the phone calls are not random. The voice is reading from something. I don't know what. But after my 6th shift, I noticed that the words the voice said corresponded to actions taken in the archive the following night. Confirmed preceded a new box appearing. Updated preceded changes to existing labels. On my 8th shift, the voice said, transferred, and the next night, an entire shelf in row F had been rearranged. Files I'd seen in one location were in a different location, in a different order, with different reference numbers on their spine. The phone calls are instruction, not to you, to the archive. Third, you may not have read instructions 9 through 12 carefully. Read them again. Read them tonight. Pay specific attention to instruction 11. The note ended there. Below it, on the 2nd page, was a single additional paragraph. I stopped coming after my 11th shift. I don't know if that was my choice. I woke up on what should have been my 12th night, and I could not remember the door code. I could not remember the name of the road. I tried to drive there and I got lost 3 times on roads I'd driven 11 times before. Something had changed, not in the world, but in me. The job had closed around me and then released me, and in the release it had taken something that I can't identify, but that I feel the absence of every day. I am writing this note in the parking lot of a gas station in Chillicothe because I drove here without knowing why and found this notebook on the passenger seat of my car, open to these blank pages, with a pen I don't own sitting in the crease. I'm writing because it wants me to write. I don't know if that means I'm helping you or helping it. There was no name, no date, no signature. I turned to the instruction pages and read 9 through 12. 9. If you find documents in the archive that appear to have been recently handled warm to the touch, slightly displaced, bearing fresh crease marks, do not read them. Return them to their exact position. If you cannot determine their exact position, place them on the front desk and log the row and shelf number. They will be refiled by the next shift cycle. 10. Between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m., the archive may generate new files autonomously. You may hear the sound of paper being produced, folders being opened, or labels being written. Do not attempt to locate the source. These are processing sounds, and they are part of the archive's normal function. 11. If your name appears on any document, shelf label, folder tab, or box front that you did not create, do not remove it. Do not cross it out. Do not alter it in any way. Your name is part of the index. Altering the index will result in immediate reclassification. 12. At the end of each shift, return this notebook to the bottom desk drawer. If the notebook is not in the bottom drawer when you arrive for your next shift, note its location in the log. Do not move it back to the drawer. It is where it has placed itself. I read instruction 11 3 times. Your name is part of the index. Altering the index will result in immediate reclassification. I did not know what reclassification meant, but the previous technician's note had mentioned they haven't pulled your file yet, and the names in row H had dates on them that looked like end dates, and instruction 6 had told me I was already inside the active index, and the cumulative weight of all of this was settling onto my chest like a physical thing. I logged the time. 10:04 p.m. I noted in the log that the notebook had been on the desk, not in the drawer, per instruction. 12. Then I picked up the brass keys and entered the archive. I went directly to row H. I know the instruction said not to enter after midnight, and it was only 10:09 p.m., so I was within the allowed window. But I want to be clear, I wasn't following the rules anymore because they seemed like reasonable workplace policies. I was following them because the previous technician had told me to follow them, and the previous technician was the closest thing to a human voice I'd encountered in this entire experience, and their fear had been specific enough to be credible. Row H was the same, and it was not the same. The thin, dark boxes were there, the white labels, the names, but there were more of them. I was sure of that. The first night, the boxes had occupied perhaps 2.5 shelves on the left side of the row. Now they filled 3 full shelves, and the beginning of a 4th. I walked slowly down the row, reading labels. Patricia Kern, September 14th, 2019. David Almeida, March 7th, 2021. Marcus Cole, November 22nd, 2022. Janine Tor, June 15th, 2023. These were the ones I'd seen before, but past them, on the 3rd shelf, were names I hadn't seen, or names that hadn't been there. Robert Chan, August 3rd, 2023. Yolanda Price, January 19th, 2024. Neil Ashworth, April 2nd, 2024. And at the very end of the 3rd shelf, placed with its front label facing outward, as if it had been filed neatly and recently, Corinne Blackwell active, not a date, a status. My box didn't have an end date. It had a classification. I didn't touch it. Instruction 11 was specific. Do not remove. Do not cross out. Do not alter. But I stood there in the half-light at the edge of row H, and I looked at that box with my name on it. And I understood something that I think the previous technicians must have all understood at exactly the same point in their employment. The job was real. The archive was real. The filing system was real. And I was not an employee monitoring the archive. I was a record being processed by it. The shifts, the readings, the phone calls, the logging. These weren't tasks that maintained the archive. They were inputs, data points. The archive was using my compliance to build my file, one shift at a time, and when the file was complete, the status would change from active to a date. The date would be the last night I came to work. I looked at my watch, my phone, technically, since instruction 1 said to use the desk clock, and I'd been careful about that for logging purposes. But I wasn't logging this, and it was 10:22 p.m. I had an hour and 38 minutes before the row H restriction kicked in. I reached for my box. I know, instruction 11, but I want you to understand what it feels like to see your own name on a container in a place like that, in a row of containers that all belong to people who are gone. Rational thought doesn't apply. Self-preservation doesn't collaborate with rule compliance. My hand moved toward it, the way your hand reaches for a door handle in a fire, not because you've decided to open the door, but because the part of you that needs to know is older and faster than the part of you that calculates risk. My fingers touched the edge of the box. It was warm, not room temperature warm, like something alive had been holding it, or like it had generated its own heat from within. I pulled it forward half an inch on the shelf. Behind me, at the far end of the archive, a filing cabinet opened. Not the gentle sound I'd heard before. This was sharp, metallic, deliberate, like a drawer yanked open by someone who wanted me to hear it. I froze. The sound held the drawer stayed open for 5, 6, 7 seconds. Then it closed, hard. The clang echoed off the concrete floor and the metal shelving and died in the space above the rows like the last note of something final. I let go of the box. I stepped back from the shelf. The archive was silent again, but the quality of the silence had changed. Before, the silence in the archive had felt like absence, the empty, neutral quiet of a room with no one in it. Now the silence felt like attention, like the room was listening to me decide what to do next. And the room had a preference. I left row H. I went back to the front room. I closed the interior door, which I had been leaving open on my previous shifts, and sat down at the desk. My hands were shaking. I opened the notebook and wrote, 10:24 p.m. found personal file in row H, active status. Touched the box. Filing cabinet sound from rear of archive, leaving row H. At midnight, I was supposed to take my environmental reading. That meant going back into the archive. I sat at the desk and watched the clock count down from 10:24 to 11 to 11:30 to 11:45 to 11:58. And with each passing minute, I became more aware of a new sound coming from behind the interior door. Not a filing cabinet, not paper, something quieter and more continuous. A sound like slow, careful sorting. The sound of someone going through documents one at a time, lifting, examining, replacing, lifting, examining, replacing, patient, methodical, endless. At 12 a.m., I opened the interior door. The archive was exactly as I'd left it. No movement, no visible disturbance, no sign that anything had been touched. The sorting sound had stopped the instant I opened the door. Not faded, not trailed off. Stopped, like a recording paused at the precise moment of interruption. I walked to the thermometer between rows D and E. 47 degrees. 1 degree below the threshold in instruction 4. Below 48 degrees meant close the archive door and do not reopen until the next scheduled reading. I recorded the number. I walked back to the interior door, and as I pulled it shut, I glanced down the aisle toward row H, and I saw something that I have not been able to explain or forget in all the months since. At the far end of row H, barely visible at the edge of the last functioning fluorescent tube's reach, there was a shape, not a person, not a shadow, a shape three-dimensional, solid enough to occlude the shelving behind it, but without detail, without edges I could resolve into features. It was standing in the row the way a person would stand if they were reading a shelf label at eye height. It was motionless, and on what I would have called its surface, if it had a surface, there was a faint mark, small, silver, triangular. I closed the door. I did not reopen it at 2 a.m. Instruction 4 said I could reopen it at the next scheduled reading, but it didn't say I had to. I stayed in the front room. At 2:33 a.m., the phone rang. I answered it. The paper-turning sound lasted over 4 minutes this time, and when the voice came, it said 2 words instead of 1. Reclassification pending. I hung up. I wrote it down. And I sat at that desk for 3.5 more hours, in a building where my name was on a box in a row of people who no longer existed, listening to the archive sort itself in the dark behind a closed door, waiting for 6 o'clock, waiting for the moment I could leave and drive home and decide whether I would ever come back. At 5:48 a.m., 12 minutes before my shift ended, I opened the notebook to log my departure time, and there, on the page after my last entry, in handwriting that was almost but not exactly mine, was a new line I had not written. Shift 3, integration progressing. See instruction 6. I went back. I need you to understand that I went back, and I need you to understand why, because the why is the part that still keeps me up at night. And it wasn't the money, although the money mattered. It wasn't curiosity, although I'd be lying if I said the archive didn't pull at something in me that I don't have a comfortable name for. I went back because on the drive home after that third shift, as the sun came up over the ridge east of my mother's house, and I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine and sat there in the sudden quiet of a rural morning, I realized I couldn't remember the name of the road I'd just driven. Not Campion Road, I remembered that. The road before it. The county highway I turned off of to reach Campion. I'd driven it 3 times now, both directions, and the name was gone. Not fuzzy. Gone, like a label peeled off a shelf. And I thought about the previous technician's note. Something had changed not in the world, but in me. The job had closed around me and then released me. And in the release, it had taken something. They had stopped after 11 shifts. They had lost the door code, the road, the ability to find the building, and they'd felt the absence of something unnamed every day after. I didn't want that. I didn't want to be released with pieces missing. I thought, and I recognize now how irrational this was, how precisely it followed the logic the archive needed me to follow, that if I kept going, if I completed whatever process was underway, I might come out the other side whole. That the people whose names were on boxes in row H had tried to leave too early or too late, and that there was a window, a correct window, and if I found it and stepped through it at exactly the right moment, I could walk away intact. That's how the archive thinks for you. It gives you just enough information to construct a theory of survival that requires you to keep showing up. Shift 4, Tuesday night. I arrived at 9:45, entered the code. The notebook was on the desk again. I noted its position in the log, per instruction 12. I opened it. My entries were there, all of them, including the line I hadn't written. Shift 3, integration progressing. See instruction 6. Below it, in the same, almost mine handwriting, was a new line. Shift 4, environmental threshold breach logged. Row H access restricted per standard protocol. Reclassification timeline adjusted. I hadn't even started my shift yet. The entry was already there. The notebook had logged a shift that was still in progress, or hadn't yet begun, as if the distinction between future and past didn't apply inside the archive system. I stared at the words reclassification timeline adjusted and tried to feel something useful. Fear, resolve, clarity. But all I felt was the dull, specific exhaustion of someone who has been given information they cannot act on. I entered the archive at 10:08 p.m. The temperature was 52 degrees, warmer than the night before. Whatever had dropped it below 48 at midnight on shift 3 had corrected itself, or been corrected. The sorting sound was absent. The rows were still and silent, and for the first 20 minutes I almost convinced myself that the building was just a building, that the boxes were just boxes, that the notebook was just a notebook with a previous employee's idea of a joke in it. Then I reached row F, and I found the transfers. 3 shelves in row F had been completely reorganized. Files I'd seen on my first and second shifts, standard-looking county documents in manila folders. Nothing remarkable had been replaced with different files. These were in dark green folders I hadn't seen before, each one labeled with a white sticker bearing a reference number and, beneath the number, a small silver triangle drawn in ink. The triangle matched the one on the notebook's cover. Same proportions, same slight asymmetry, same arrowhead shape. I pulled one of the green folders off the shelf. The label read, REF-0041-C, Intake Assessment, Blackwell, C. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a form printed, not handwritten, with fields and checkboxes. At the top it said, Annex 2, Personnel Integration Record. Below that were fields for name, start date, shift count, compliance rating, and a section labeled Index Status with 3 checkboxes, preliminary, active, and permanent. The active box was checked. My name was in the name field. My actual start date, the date of my first shift, was in the date field. The shift count said 4, which was the shift I was currently on. The compliance rating said 94%, with a note beside it in small type. 1 physical contact violation, row H, shift 3. I had touched the box, my box, in row H. That was the violation. The archive had recorded it, quantified it, and docked my compliance score for it. At the bottom of the form, in a section labeled Notes, there was a single line of handwritten text. Same blue ink as the previous technician's note, but different handwriting, rounder, more deliberate, with a slight tremor in the longer strokes. She's reading this now. Note that she did not put the folder down after seeing her name, as per instruction 8. Log the deviation. I dropped the folder. It hit the concrete floor with a sound like a small breath, and in the silence that followed, I heard something I had never heard before in the archive. Not a filing cabinet, not paper turning, a pen. The unmistakable, delicate scratch of a pen writing on paper, coming from somewhere past row H, somewhere in the rows I'd never walked because the lights didn't reach them, and nothing in the instructions required me to go there. The pen wrote steadily for perhaps 10 seconds, then stopped. Then a page turned. Then the pen resumed. Something was recording my deviation in real time. I left the folder on the floor. I know instruction 9 said to place found documents on the front desk, but instruction 8 said if I found a document with my name on it, I should place it face down on the desk and not return to that row. These 2 instructions now contradicted each other because the document had my name on it and was also a displaced document. The previous technician's note had warned about contradiction, and instruction 6 had already told me I was inside the index. Every action I took was being logged, scored, and fed back into a file that was building itself around me like a cocoon. I went to the front room. I closed the interior door. I sat at the desk, and I pressed my palms flat against the laminate. and I breathed. The phone rang at 2:07 a.m. I answered. The paper-turning sound was faster this time, not frantic, but purposeful, like someone flipping to a specific page they already knew the location of. It lasted 15 seconds. Then the voice spoke. It said, "Integration at 60%. Non-compliant entry noted. Adjust supplementary instruction 8. The line went dead. I logged it. Then I opened the notebook to the instruction pages. Instruction 8 was the same as it had always been. If you find a document with your name on it anywhere in the archive, do not read it. Place it face down on the front desk and log the row and shelf where you found it. Do not return to that row for the rest of your shift." But as I read it, I noticed something. The period at the end of the last sentence was slightly darker than the rest of the ink, wetter, newer. I looked more closely at the instruction, and I saw that a word had been inserted between front desk and end log, so small and so carefully matched to the original handwriting that I almost didn't catch it. The instruction now read, "Place it face down on the front desk immediately and log the row and shelf where you found it." One word, immediately. It hadn't been there before. The instruction had mutated in response to the phone call, in response to my hesitation, in response to the 10 or 15 seconds I'd spent reading the intake assessment before dropping it. The archive had observed my behavior, reported it through the phone line, and the notebook had updated itself to close the gap I'd found in the rules. This is what I mean when I say the rules were alive, not metaphorically. The instructions in the notebook were a living document in the most literal sense. They responded, they adapted, they learned from the mistakes of the person reading them, and they tightened themselves accordingly. Every shift I worked, every deviation I made, every second I spent in a row I shouldn't have been in or reading a document I shouldn't have read. The system incorporated my behavior and refined its protocols. I wasn't maintaining the archive. I was training it. I took my 4 a.m. reading, 50 degrees. I logged it. I finished the shift. I went home. I came back Wednesday night for shift 5. Shift 5 was when I found the cabinet. I hadn't explored past row L before. The instructions only referenced rows A through L, and the lighting ended somewhere around row J. But on shift 5, at approximately 11:40 p.m., I was taking a slow walk through row K, which was far enough from the working fluorescence that I needed the flashlight from the desk drawer, when the beam caught something against the back wall of the archive. Not shelving, not boxes. A freestanding object, taller than the shelving units, pushed against the wall in the narrow gap between the end of row K and the end of row L. A filing cabinet. Not the industrial multi-drawer kind you'd find in an office. This was a single unit, dark wood, not metal with brass hardware that matched the keys I'd been given. It had 5 drawers, each one with a small brass pull and a rectangular label holder, the kind where you slide a card in behind a brass frame. The labels from top to bottom read, "Preliminary Active Permanent Transferred Reclaimed." I tried the brass keys. The third one on the ring fit the top drawer. I opened it. Inside were index cards, hundreds of them filed vertically, each one bearing a name, a date range, a series of reference numbers, and a status notation. I flipped through the first dozen. Names I didn't recognize, date ranges spanning weeks, sometimes months, status notations that read things like "integration complete filed," or "integration suspended insufficient data," or "integration complete transferred to primary archive." Primary archive. This place, the annex, was the secondary facility. The county listing called it Annex 2. There was a primary archive somewhere else, and this building was feeding it. I closed the top drawer and tried the second one. Active. The key didn't work. I tried all 4 keys. None of them fit. The active drawer was locked with a different mechanism, and the keys I'd been given, the keys the job had provided, did not open it. I pressed my ear against the wood. Inside, I could hear something. Not sound, exactly, but vibration. A faint, continuous hum, like a machine running at very low power, or like the collective resonance of many small things in motion. Papers being sorted, files being updated, index cards being written by a pen that didn't need a hand to hold it. The permanent drawer was also locked. So was transferred. I tried the bottom drawer reclaimed, and it opened. It was empty, completely empty, clean, smelling faintly of the same chemical preservative that permeated the archive. And at the very back of the drawer, lying flat against the wood, was a single item, a photograph, not a Polaroid, a standard 4x6 print, slightly faded, with a crease across one corner. It showed the front room of the annex, the same desk, the same lamp, the same phone. And sitting at the desk, facing the camera, was a woman I didn't recognize. She was middle-aged, dark-haired, wearing a gray cardigan. She wasn't smiling. Her hands were flat on the desk, the same position mine had been in an hour ago when I'd sat there trying to breathe. And on the desk in front of her, clearly visible, was the black notebook, open to a page I couldn't read from the angle of the photograph. I turned the photo over. On the back, in pencil, someone had written, Tor J, final shift, reclaimed, Janine Tor, the most recent name in row H, date, June 15th, 2023. This was her photograph, taken on her last night, and her drawer classification was reclaimed, not filed, not transferred, not completed, reclaimed, like something the archive had lent out and then taken back. I put the photograph in my jacket pocket. I know I shouldn't have. I know the instructions said not to remove, not to alter, not to change anything in the index. But I took it because Janine Tor was a real person who had sat at the same desk and followed the same rules and ended up as a classification in a wooden drawer, and I needed something physical, something outside the notebook and the archive and the phone calls to prove to myself that this was happening. I closed the cabinet. I went back to the front room. At midnight, the phone rang outside the 1 a.m. to 3 a.m. window, which meant instruction 5 said not to answer. I let it ring. It rang 19 times. On the 20th ring, it stopped, and the notebook, which was open on the desk to my current log page, made a small sound, the sound a page makes when it's being written on. I watched the open page. Nothing appeared, but when I turned to the instruction pages, instruction 11 had changed, the old version. If your name appears on any document, shelf label, folder tab, or box front that you did not create, do not remove it. The new version. If your name appears on any document, shelf label, folder tab, box front, or cabinet index that you did not create, do not remove it. Do not remove any item from the cabinet. Items removed from the cabinet will be recovered. It knew. The archive knew I had taken the photograph, and it had rewritten the rules to address what I'd done, and it had added a warning that felt less like an instruction and more like a promise. Items removed from the cabinet will be recovered. I worked 3 more shifts after that. 6, 7, 8. Each one followed the same pattern, the notebook on the desk when I arrived. New log entries in the almost mine handwriting already recorded for shifts I hadn't yet completed. Phone calls with increasingly specific language. On shift 6, the voice said, integration at 82%, compliance recalculated. On shift 7, it said, permanent classification pending 2 shifts remaining. On shift 8, it said nothing at all, just the paper turning sound for 11 minutes, and then the line went dead. On shift 8, I found a second green folder in row D. It was thicker than the first 1/2 inch of documents inside it, all printed forms identical to the intake assessment, but with different headings. Behavioral log compliance trend analysis, shift pattern summary, environmental interaction record. Each one filled with data I recognized as my own, my readings, my log entries, my movements through the rows, my exact timestamps for every action I'd taken across 8 shifts. The archive hadn't just been watching me, it had been studying me with the patience and precision of something that had done this dozens of times before and had refined its methodology with each iteration. The last page in the folder was different from the rest. It wasn't a form, it was a letter, typed, not printed, on paper that felt older and heavier than the others. It was addressed to Current Night Technician, Annex 2, and it read, your integration period is nearing completion. Upon completion of your 10th shift, your status will be updated from active to permanent. Permanent status is not reversible. Permanent records are transferred to the primary archive for long-term retention. If you wish to request early termination of your integration period, do not return for your next scheduled shift. Early termination will result in partial reclamation. Partial reclamation is not reversible. Please see Instruction 6. Instruction 6. Always Instruction 6. You are already inside the active index. Your entry was cataloged when you opened this notebook. This is not a warning. This is a status update. I did not go back for shift 9. I did not go back for shift 10. I stayed in my mother's house with the doors locked and the lights on, and I waited for something to happen. For 2 days, nothing did. The photograph of Janine Torr sat on my kitchen table where I'd placed it, and I looked at it every few hours, as if checking that it was still there, still real, still proof. On the third night, the night that would have been shift 11, I woke up at 2:14 a.m. to the sound of the telephone. Not my cell phone, the landline, my mother's old landline, the one I hadn't used since she died, the one I was fairly sure I'd had disconnected because I wasn't paying the bill. It was ringing, the old mechanical bell, the same frequency as the phone on the desk at the annex. I got out of bed. I walked to the kitchen. The phone was on the wall next to the refrigerator, a cream-colored rotary model my mother had kept for decades. I picked it up, paper turning, slow, methodical, patient. Then the voice. Early termination confirmed. Partial reclamation in progress. Status updated. Reclaimed. Partial. The line went dead. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, and I looked at the table where Janine Torr's photograph had been sitting for 3 days. The photograph was gone. In its place, lying flat on the table, was a single index card, white, unlined, with neat typed text. Blackwell Corinne shifts completed. 8 of 10 integration. 82% status. Reclaimed partial notes. 1 item recovered. Supplementary file retained. See Annex 2, Row H, active shelf. The index card was warm, not room temperature. Warm like something alive had been holding it, or like it had carried its own heat from the place it came from. I still have the index card, and it's in the top drawer of my desk, under a stack of bills I keep meaning to pay. Every few weeks I take it out and look at it, and every time I do, the integration percentage is different. Last month it said 84%. This morning, before I sat down to write this, it said 87. I don't know what happens at 100. I don't know if it reaches 100 on its own, through some slow process I can't perceive, or if it requires me to do something, to go back, to open the notebook, to complete the shifts I didn't finish. I do know 3 things. The first is that the building is still there. I check the satellite view every week. The parking lot is always empty. The windows are always dark. The brass plate is too small to read from the satellite, but I know it's there. The second is that the County Employment Board posted a new listing last Tuesday. Same position, same pay, same hours, same single instruction at the bottom of the posting. Please do not arrive early. The third is that 3 nights ago, I found a black notebook in the bottom drawer of my desk at home. It wasn't there the day before. It's matte black, hardcover, with a silver triangle embossed slightly off-center on the front. I haven't opened it. I've placed it in a box in the garage, under a tarp, behind 3 other boxes, and I've told myself I won't touch it again, but I can hear it at night. Not a sound, exactly, more like a frequency, the low, patient hum of something being sorted, something being filed, something being completed, 1 page at a time, whether I participate or not. Instruction 6 was right. I was already inside the active index the moment I opened the first notebook. But what Instruction 6 didn't say, what none of the instructions said, is that the index doesn't need you to be in the building to keep writing your file. It just needs you to have started. If you see a listing for a night technician position at a county records annex, any county, any state, any listing that tells you not to arrive early, close the page. Don't apply. Don't drive out to see the building. Don't tell yourself you need the money badly enough, because the notebook is patient and the archive doesn't close, and your file is already open. You just haven't read Instruction 6 yet.